You've seen the big plays.
Jaron stepping to his right, looking, stopping, firing, end zone, touchdown!
You've heard what the playmakers and coaches have had to say.
Up press Graves, got it!
But now it's time to go behind the mic with BYU Sports Broadcasters to get their distinctive take on the games.
Oh, what an aggressive play!
This is Behind the Mic with host Cleon Wall.
We're here to bring you unique insights and stories from the BYU Sports Broadcasters who cover the Cougars and from the Cougars themselves. When did you first start liking sports? That's a good story that can evoke a lot of good and possibly bad emotions, but mostly good. For me, I remember playing soccer, t-ball, and youth basketball when I was young, but I was not aggressive playing any of the sports, and I was never really very good at them as I grew up. I didn't really start loving sports until I was a preteen, and I used to watch NFL games with my stepdad. For some reason, that spurred me on to becoming more competitive and then watching gobs and gobs of sports. I wanted to talk to others about falling in love with sports here at BYU Broadcasting, so I brought in fellow broadcasters, Brandon Crow, who produces features for BYUtv, Harrison Collier, who produces games, Hema Heimuli produces BYU Sports Nation Game Day and also the coaches shows, and BYUtv and radio personality Jason Shepherd. First thing I wanted to know was how they were introduced to sports, whether it was playing or watching it. We started off with Brandon Crow.
It was something that I was just born into. Like both my parents, my mom and dad, they were both very huge sports fans. And a lot of my family friends and even now, like they kind of say that my mom is like the biggest sports fan. She grew up in Boise, so she was a big Boise State fan. But growing up in Southern California, we were a UCLA family. So we had basketball season tickets for over 30 years. We've had football season tickets. And so I remember, like, I have vivid memories of when I was a kid, especially during the 95 championship run that the Bruins had, of my mom being, like, 2 feet away from the TV, and she'd be screaming, and she'd be jumping up and down, and then my dad would be jumping up and down. And so it was essentially just the whole thing that I just grew up in. It was a world that I grew up in, and I just really never thought anything else. I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later down the road, but I was not a big BYU guy growing up, and
we're going to need you to leave.
Yeah, and so I think it's kind of funny that you have 4 of us in here, and I think only one is from Utah, Hema, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting because I didn't grow up in Southern California. I didn't grow up like with the access to be able to watch BYU stuff. And so I really didn't have like this huge diehard affinity for BYU sports until like a little bit later.
Hema, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up big BYU fan, obviously, because my dad, my uncles, a couple cousins played here. But I'll say that, like, you know, I definitely enjoyed playing sports more than watching at the beginning. I grew up with a bunch of cousins my age, and we always played like football in the street and things like that. And that's kind of where my love of sports came from. It wasn't until a little bit later where I started enjoying actually watching the game and not necessarily being there playing. Off the top of my head is, you know, me and my dad watched the Utah Jazz beat the Suns on that shot, and that was a crazy memory, and that was kind of like the first time I was like, oh wow, like watching sports is just as fun as playing them. And so that's where my love began for watching sports, but I always loved playing sports, any sport, when I was little.
Well, it kind of helps when, you know, your dad played collegiately and you have other family members, so it probably helps out a little bit there. What about you, Jason?
Yeah, my very first memory from a sports perspective is George Brett and the Kansas City Royals. That was my very first sports memory, and really my very first sports love was baseball. And so, you know, growing up in Independence, you know, I would go to Kansas City Royals games all the time, and that really got me into it. And, you know, I was lucky enough that when the Royals won their World Series in '85, I was old enough to be able to understand what was going on, and it was a really, really big deal that our team won the World Series in 1985. And so that really sort of upped the ante. That not only did we have a major league team in town, but we just won the World Series, you know, and I've told this story before. My parents are divorced, so my dad lives closer to St. Louis. So I would go, when I was visiting my dad, we'd go to Cardinals games all the time. So baseball was a really, really important part of my life as an adolescent while we lived in Missouri, whether it was Kansas City Royals or St. Louis Cardinals games. We moved to Utah after 7th grade. So I started 8th grade here. So I was 13 when we moved to Utah. And I honestly, as big of a sports fan as I was, I really became a sports fanatic when we moved out here. And I owe it to my grandma. My grandma took me to my very first BYU football game. I remember it was Ty Detmer was the quarterback. It was against Air Force. I remember exactly where we sat at Lavelle Edwards Stadium. And she also took me to my very first Utah Jazz game. And
that's awesome.
That point in my life from 13 on is where I wasn't just a sports fan. Like, this was it for me. Like, sports, that's what I wanted to do. And it was like I played sports like with friends and whatnot, but I was all about watching sports and getting to know things about the athletes, and that, like, from 13 on, that's all it was. And kind of like what Brandon was saying, like growing up in Independence, I didn't know anything about BYU sports. Like, it wasn't talked about. My family, they weren't big sports fans, so how I got into it as much as I did is somewhat of a mystery. But it was when I got here to Utah at age 13, and my grandma took me to that first game. That's from that point on, BYU all the way, like diehard Cougar.
All right, Harrison, what about you?
I'm just kind of thinking about what everyone said, and for me, it started at a young age, and it was just I loved everything about sports. And growing up, my dad and I would play all the time, and he would. One of the earliest memories that I had is he took one of our kitchen chairs and taped like these wiffle bats so we could practice kicking field goals in the house.
Nice.
Which was pretty fun.
Sure, your mom loved that.
Yes, she really loved that. And then another memory I have is, do you guys remember the 25-cent football helmets?
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
That you get out. So early on, my mom wanted to teach me my colors and get those. Well, I learned the football teams before I learned the colors of those. And so my at home, I have this huge bag of all these things of the helmets, and you
still have them?
Yeah, I still have them.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so they're not disintegrating quite yet, but they're pretty. It's pretty fun how I kind of gravitated to it, and I loved watching and playing. I always did something, whether played baseball, basketball, football, hockey. I was always doing something. I couldn't stay inside. I wanted to be outside and play.
Totally.
And so that was a big thing for me.
You know, it's interesting. I remember watching sports for the first time. It's kind of hazy. It was like I was around 10 or 11. And I remember just watching NFL games with my stepdad on Sundays. And here are the two vivid memories I have. Why are the Cowboys always on the TV? And why do I like this so much? I couldn't understand because, as I said, when I was younger, I played sports, but I wasn't really that good at them. I'm not saying I got better when I got older. I think I got a little bit better when I got older. But there was just something about the competition, whether it was playing it or watching it, that I loved being a part of. Hema, why don't we go to, what was it about sports that just kind of like drew you in and you're like, yeah, this is what I love about sports?
I mean, so like, you know how I mentioned I liked playing sports first, and growing up I had like a bunch of cousins my age, so we always were playing outside. And similarly to like what you guys said, our parents probably just didn't want us in the house all day, and so they just left
Go
us
out and
outside.
do something.
Yeah, but we played sports together, mostly football. And the thing that I loved most about it was just beating other kids, like beating my cousins, even the ones that were older. You know, you think about recess. Recess, I just played sports. We like left.
Yep.
As soon as you hit the doors, it was on.
Yep.
And the whole recess, you just played a game, whether it was football or kickball or whatever, right?
Foursquare, tetherball, handball,
Anything.
basketball.
Even at recess for us, we would continue, like if we had 2 recesses that day, it would be like the first half, and then we'd go to class, and then it would be the same teams, and it's halftime, and then the second half.
You had 2 recesses?
Some days, like we would have it, like as you got older, you would only have 2 recesses instead of like 3.
Three?
Yeah.
What? What school did you go to? I had one recess.
I had two.
I only had one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had
one.
We had morning and we had lunch.
Yep.
Had
So
lunch.
the morning recess was like the short one, and then lunch was the long recess.
Yeah.
But we did the same thing. We would split it up into two different halves.
See, here, so I'm not a smart person, but I've come up with this. I've come up with this saying that I think sort of encapsulates my whole opinion on sports. And again, I played sports with my friends growing up, and I always did that kind of stuff, whether it was baseball, basketball, football, that kind of stuff, kickball, all of it. But my sports, it was about watching it, like watching it on TV, whether in person or on TV. And so somebody had asked me this question years and years ago, and so I thought of this saying that I think just makes it just puts it into perspective for me, and by that I mean out of perspective. But I always tell people I love sports because for 3 hours, something that means absolutely nothing means everything.
Yeah.
And that's the way I've always looked at sports. In the grand scheme of things, sports doesn't mean anything. It's entertainment. But for those 3 hours while you're watching it, if you're in it and it's your team, it means everything. And that's why I love sports.
Harrison and also Brandon, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, like I see what Shep is saying, but I've also seen on the other side, like I've seen the power that sports has to be able to bring people together, and so I do feel like that sports. The reason why I think I love it so much is that it's the biggest and most realistic comparison to life, where you have like the underdogs and you have like the people that are supposed to be the best, but then they have mistakes, and then you get those underdogs, those long shots that come up and they win. They captivate your heart, and I think for us as humans, we love stories and we love storytelling, and then we're able to see a story unfold. We're able to see a guy that struck out 10 times in his last 11 at bats, and he comes up and he's down to his last strike, and then he hits a game-winning home run. It's stuff like that, and even just thinking about this and talking about this, I get like chills thinking about certain things. But I just love it. For me, it's home. Sports is just home. Like growing up in Southern California, I knew I wanted to be a sports broadcaster when I was like 6 or 7. And growing up, I was blessed to have 3 of what I think are the best, to ever do it in my hometown. You had Chick Hearn for the Lakers, Bob Miller for the Kings, and then Vince Scully for the Dodgers. And they were like members of our family. Like we'd eat together as a family at dinner time, and we wouldn't say, "Hey, did you see, Eric Karros' home run?" It was like, "Hey, remember that story Vin told last night? Like that was awesome." Or did you hear Bob's call? Or did you hear what Chick said about the Pistons and about Isaiah Thomas being a whiner? Like that. Like those were the conversations that we would have, and it was just like those guys became part of our family, and so it just became much more than that to us.
Yeah, I think for me with sports it's a perfect metaphor for life. Like for those 60 minutes that you're playing in that game, it goes up. You have ups and downs, and it's how you respond during those 60 minutes. You can easily just fold after something doesn't go your way within the first 5 minutes, or you can battle back and come from behind. I mean, there's a couple that come to mind that will always stick with me. One of them was with the Mighty Ducks. Paul Correa was playing in the Stanley Cup Finals against the New Jersey Devils, and in that, he gets laid out coming across the middle by Scott Stevens, and he must have had a concussion and taken off the ice. I was like, he's not coming back, and he was one of my favorite players. Probably about 10, 15 minutes later, he comes back on the bench, and the fans are going nuts, and then he takes the ice for his next shift, goes down and scores, and the place just erupts, and the Ducks go on to win that game just because of that momentum and that momentum shift. And so that just makes me think of anything in life where, hey, you'll get knocked down, and it's how you respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, to what Brandon said in terms of knowing he wanted to be a broadcaster since he was little, I was kind of in the same. But look, anybody that's met me, I'm not going to be an athlete. I'm not a big guy. I was never going to do anything, Wasn't going to play football.
If you worked more on your legs, you could have been a soccer player.
Fair point. Hey, I did some squats earlier today after I did a couple reps on the bench. But anyway, so like I knew I was not going to be playing. Broadcasters were not going to be talking about me. I knew that in my life. But to be able to be a part of sports the way that I am as a broadcaster, like calling a game, whatever sport it is, to me, that's like me playing. You know what I mean? Like, that's my way of connecting with the players. That's why that's one of the aspects of my job that I love the most is the team aspect. And I have been blessed here at BYU to be brought in by all of the teams that I cover and broadcast games for. They treat me like a teammate, and I love that part of it. And so when I'm calling a game or on the sideline of a game, that's the closest to me. That's like being on the court and doing my thing, and that's why I love my job so much.
Speaking about that, just real quickly on one of the reasons why I love sports as well is growing up playing it. You have these teammates that you become friends with because you go through these experiences together. You go through these grueling practices. You all, come together and you like saying whatever about the coach underneath your breath as he's making you do sprints and all this stuff. But on the outside, you look at it and it's just, you have all these kids, all these people from different walks of life, and then you come together, you put one uniform on, and you're throwing aside everything else in your life essentially for that time that you're playing together, and then you are united, you are together, and you form a bond. And since I don't play like I used to anymore, I have like a city league softball team, whatever, but it's just I miss that camaraderie, I miss that bond that I had with those teammates of mine. When
we come back, the guys talk about their favorite moments in sports that keep them coming back for more, and their first experience with BYU sports. Welcome back to our roundtable on Behind the Mic on why we love sports. Brandon and Harrison brought up a couple of different things that made me think of that moment of elation, whether you're playing or watching a sport. There's just that moment where, I don't know if it's the first moment or just a moment of elation where you're like, this is why I love sports so much. I don't know if this is my first one, but I'll give you one that just sticks with me, and it's pretty popular. When I was 15, the Los Angeles Dodgers, my favorite baseball team, they were in the World Series versus the Oakland A's. Game 1, Kirk Gibson gets up. He's hobbled. This is going to be the only time we're going to probably see him in this. He's pinch hitting, and he hits a 2-run home run. And I just remember thinking, this is the best thing in the whole world. I hope I get to feel this forever and ever. And in sports, you don't get to feel that for a long time. It's that one moment. And unless you're cheering for a team that wins it so often, and then you're like, well, which championship was the best? I mean, for some of us, it's it's more like, it was that moment that just like, oh, man, this is why I love sports so much. I want to feel this so much more and more. What were some of the moments in your guys' lives that just kind of like kept you going? Kind of like that golf shot where you're like, you hit the one good golf shot and you're like, yeah, this is why I keep golfing. What was that moment in sports where you're like, oh, I know exactly where I was, what I was doing, and why this, drew me into sports even more? Why don't we start off with Harrison?
Oh, man. As you were describing that, I was thinking of a lot of moments. One of them on a BYU side was the 1996 Texas A&M game, and just watching everything that was going on. That I can still hear Brent Musburger's call when he throws to Ko Lalui, and they score that touchdown. And the elation and seeing everyone just go nuts. And we were going nuts at home. It was like, all right, we're going to beat this big name opponent. And then to see that going on later in the Cotton Bowl just made it even more exciting. In non-BYU games, I can think of a handful of moments where I was like, I'll never forget where I was. One of them was watching the Red Sox come down 0-3 to beat the Yankees, and just watching each game, and you're like, are they going to do it again? And they did. And then it's like, are they going to finally break this curse? Like, and for them to do what they did was exciting.
Thanks for bringing up a painful memory, because the Red Sox beat my Cardinals in that World Series.
You're welcome. I was going to bring up another painful memory for all of us, but it's something that sticks with me, is that the Michael Jordan shot against the Jazz.
Hey, don't say us. I'm not lumped
sorry.
in there.
Oh, okay. But like those type of moments where it's like you know exactly where you're at, and the excitement or the complete disappointment where you're just like, oh man, we were that close, and then just to see that moment, or the just unbelievable plays from like the Tanner Mangum Hail Mary, all of a sudden, and then the next week he does it again, and you're just like, wow, this is kind of out of a storybook.
That's awesome. I remember, like, so I mentioned already the John Stockton shot. Like, that was a fun memory, because I was watching it mostly because my dad wanted to watch it, and he likes the Jazz, and so I was watching the game with him, and I shared that moment with him, which is kind of special. But I'll share with you the one where it was kind of just me and my sports fandom. I was a Rams fan growing up because you know, I mean, greatest show on turf. There's so much to talk about. It was so fun. But I do remember specifically, I think it was Super Bowl 34, when they were playing the Titans, and Kevin Dyson got stopped at the goal line.
Yeah.
And I just remember freaking out, like, about that stop. Yeah, and so that's a cool memory, just because that was like probably the first fandom that was purely mine. Like, my dad didn't care about the Rams. Nobody cared about the Rams except for me.
The other one that stands out to me, thinking about, especially with my dad, it was Lavelle's last game against Utah. I remember I was downstairs with my family, with my cousins, doing something because it was over Thanksgiving. And my dad's like, hey, Harrison, come upstairs real quick. And I'm like, all right. So I go upstairs, and it's the final drive to watch BYU drive down and finally score, because it was Lavelle's last game. And he's like, hey, you need to watch. We should watch this. And it was amazing to go from, was it 4th down to margin hooks, and then just slowly getting all the way down the field, and then that final play and seeing Lavelle get lifted up and carried off the field for his last game was pretty cool.
Well, and to date myself, I was at that game as a member of the media on the goal line. I was right next to the pylon when Doman crossed the goal line for that touchdown. So, yeah, like I actually tweeted about this within the last week, so it's funny that we're having this conversation. And this has not changed, by the way, in almost 20 years. The top 2 sports moments for me in my life have stayed very consistent. Number 1 is Stockton hitting the shot against Houston in the 97 Western Conference Finals to go to the NBA Finals for the very first time. That is hands down the greatest sports moment of my life. Wow. I will never forget where I was at. I'll never forget after I was at a friend's house watching it, driving back to my house, and I get to a stoplight on 6200 South and Redwood Road. I remember exactly where I was. And I looked at the car next to me. We did not speak. We just looked at each other. I had a huge smile. He responded with a massive smile, and we both knew exactly what we were smiling about. The other one was, and I say it's fairly recent, we're coming up on almost 20 years, but it's Beck to Harleen. That is a very, very close second. And again, I was there in a media capacity, so I had to sort of suppress it, although I didn't do a very good job because I ended up jumping in the air. But I was on the sidelines, on the BYU sideline, just north of where the players were. And that play, that and the John Stockton 3 to send the Jazz to the finals, hands down, without question, the 2 greatest sports moments of my life.
Wow. Hard to top all that, and Shep's emotion. The 95, Tyus Edney, UCLA run. I remember that. That was like my first real kick because I was 8 years old, and I just remember like that was when they first kind of really kind of started comprehending what was going on. I remember that for sure. My mom's. I could still close my eyes and see like hear my mom screaming and everything. But a couple years after that, I was a big kid in Little League, and so I would hit home runs. I just had this one monster season, and so then that was the same season that Mark McGuire was going on his tear, and so people would call me Little Mac all the time. And I remember being in Food for Less in the parking lot with my dad. And we had just gotten out of Food for Less shopping, and I was like running to the car, ripped open the thing. I grabbed his keys, put it in the ignition, and I turned it to the radio station so I could hear. And right as I turned the dial is when Mark hit his 60-second home run. And then we were on our way to go visit somebody in our church who was sick or something. And I literally sprinted through their door, and they could not care any ounce of whatsoever about sports. And so I just took their remote and I turned it on Fox, and I remember watching the whole celebration. And I don't know why I was a Mark McGuire fan, but I got caught up in that moment of him and Sammy Sosa, and then the Roger Maris, all that. I got caught up in that, and then a couple years after that, there are some significant staples in the Crow household as far as sports go. Just during the Lakers three-peat, I remember being at a Dodger game in the middle of June. Marquise Grissom was up to bat, and the Dodgers were losing to the Rockies or something. And next thing you know, the whole – I get chills right now. You can see I got chills right here. The whole stadium starts chanting, Kobe, Kobe. And nobody cares about the baseball game going on. And then the Dodgers on the Jumbotron, they just put up the last 5 minutes of the Laker game. And then we watched, the Laker game.
That's cool. And
then we saw Marquise Grissom in the outfield after he struck out. They just some of the players were just caught themselves looking up there. And it's the same thing with Shep. When that happened, that was the first time that an LA sports team had won something, in a while. And you just drive around, and everybody was honking, or they'd be looking. And if you had a lake or something on or whatever, you get these random strangers coming up to you, high-fiving and stuff. And I could go on about a bunch of other things. But, those are some of the ones that stick out to me for sure.
What was your first experience? Jason kind of said it, and you can go over this again, Jason, if you want. But your first experience with BYU sports, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, my first experience was BYU football, and my grandma took me, just me. It was my grandma and me at Lavelle Edwards Stadium in the early 90s. This was my very first introduction to BYU athletics. And I remember she bought me a hat while we were at Lavelle Edwards Stadium. I remember where we sat. I remember that we beat Air Force in that game, and from that day on, I have been a BYU fan, diehard, and that'll never change.
Right. Hema?
I would say
Hema's different because I'm he's got family members who are football players.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I remember distinctly going to see my uncle Hema, who I'm named after, play often, mid-90s, almost early 90s, mid-90s. And I just remember, going to the games. I don't remember the games, really, but I do remember going to the field afterwards and, walking around and, meeting Lavelle and Lavelle saying hi, all those things. So, my fondest memories aren't necessarily tied to the games themselves, but just the experience of being at Cougar Stadium at the time. And, that's probably why that place means so much to me, is because that's where I spent time with my dad, with my uncles, going on the field and walking around. And so, yeah, my experience is probably different, but that's what I remember most.
Well, like I touched on earlier, growing up in Southern California where I just didn't have access to watching a lot of BYU games. And I remember the first time I think I can remember watching a BYU event was What do they call those? Like on ESPN on Mondays during basketball, like
midnight or like
Big Monday.
Big Monday.
Yep.
I remember watching those, and the games would come on at like 9 o'clock or something, and my dad would let me stay up and watch like a little bit. But we would go to Las Vegas and travel, whatever, there, go up to Idaho to visit my grandparents. And so sometimes we would be able to get KSL. I remember my dad would tune it in. But for me, like my first real experience with BYU sports comes from like my good family friends, the Frenches, because they had cousins, the Bills, Casey, Kelly, Craig, all those guys, they're cousins. And so I would know about BYU sports because of cheering for them. We went down to San Diego State to watch BYU play the Aztecs a couple times. But the first time I ever came up to Provo and went to a game was, I think, when Notre Dame came up with Ty Whittingham in 2004. And I just remember sitting in the stands and, I just, they said a prayer before, which I wasn't used to. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then they played the Irish fight song. And I was like, okay, interesting as well. And then we had like these students or something wearing T-shirts by us that said, Mormons supporting the Irish. And I was like, this is an interesting place.
But before Harrison goes, the funny thing, the exact opposite. So your situation was like, wow, they're saying a prayer. This is a little different. Just goes to show how many games my children have been to. When we go places that are not BYU, when they don't say a prayer, they're like, are they not going to say a prayer? I'm like, no, they're not going to say a prayer here. So just the opposite of that.
Yeah, I think everything kind of changed for me though after my mission because I got more exposed to BYU. I was at the MTC. And I was like, they would have us, practice our language and stuff. And so I remember there was a statue, and we were practicing to the statue outside, trying to get better at my Korean. And the next thing I know, like it's pretty close to LaVell Edwards Stadium, and so I just hear the announcer say something muffled. He's like, "Aah!" And then the crowd goes nuts. I was like, I have no clue what even happened. And then the next day, half of the MTC was wearing red ties, half was wearing blue ties. Come to find out, Harrison Collier made like the famous 4th down catch, and I was
right next to that.
Yeah.
I may have also jumped when that happened too.
But it was like after that, I started putting more puzzle pieces together, and then BYU was able to be more exposed on TV, and so then it became more of a thing.
Okay, Harrison.
Yeah, for me, it's hard because I grew up in Washington. So just like Brandon, getting BYU games was few and far between. And my parents both graduated from BYU. And so when any time BYU was on TV, it was a big event at our house, and we turned it on and watched it. So the biggest thing that I remember, there's a couple events, was in the 96 season. I remember watching that season as much as it could. And there was the WAC championship game in 96. We had some church program or something going on that night that I had to be at, and my dad was at home. And I remember we had a break, so I called him, and I was like, hey, what's the score? And so then he's like, oh, hey, it's going into overtime. So I stayed on the phone, and he was giving me the play-by-play of that whole overtime, which was fun. The other one, I think it was the next year. It was when the Utah kicker kicks it off the post.
Oh, yeah.
The doink.
The doink. So I remember watching this game with my dad where, BYU goes down and scores, and then something happens. BYU turns it over, and Utah just drives down easily. And my dad's just not happy. He's just like, seriously? And he just is about to go upstairs, and then I'm like, no, watch, something's gonna happen. And sure enough, the kicker kicks it off the post, and BYU goes on to win, and we're jumping up and down. But like my first experience of actually coming to a game was my freshman year, and it was in 2006. It was the Tulsa game where they had pretty much a hurricane came in with all the rain, so it had the rain delay and everything. And then my first BYU Utah game that I saw in person was 2009, the George overtime game. And this one was fun because my mom was like, so are you coming home for Thanksgiving? I'm like, nope, I'm not coming home because this is my only chance to get to see this in person, I think. And so I said, no, I'm staying here. And it was so worth it because I was on the same end zone that George caught the ball and was running towards. And so we all jumped on the field. And so those are some key moments where I'm just like, I'll never forget and stick with me.
Oh, you young whippersnappers. Harrison's sitting there talking about the 96 game against Texas A&M, and I'm like, oh, I was a student here, and I was sitting in the north end zone, and I remember the touchdown that they won that. I remember going to the WAC championship game as a student reporter. Not a good one, I will say, but anyway, I remember going to that game and being a part of it. But the thing that got me into BYU, I lived in Utah from when I was from 1 to about 12, and nothing BYU, hardly any sports, nothing BYU. I move up to Oregon, and one of my neighbors in Christmas lights puts BYU number 1 on his roof. What year is it? 1984. And so nice. I'm like, oh, I guess this is a thing. I know nothing. I mean, I grew up right around BYU, and I'm like, oh, I guess this is a thing. The next year, 1985, I don't remember why, but I came down, and BYU was playing Wyoming in a game. BYU, I still remember the score, 59-0. BYU won 59-0. And I remember being at the top of the south end zone, very last seat. And I just remember sitting there, and I got a T-shirt that said, "Here we go again," and it listed the schedule. And I still remember that, and that was what sold me on BYU sports. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. And then, of course, the next few years, you go through a little bit of a drought of no good quarterbacks, and then Ty Detmer comes along, and that kind of revived things. And kind of like what you say, what you guys have talked about, you kind of learn as you go along. You know what? BYU's not always going to be great. They're not always going to be good. You're just going to have to live with it, and it's fine. I'm still a fan.
I think we've all said this without maybe saying it specifically, but in all of our stories, anytime we've talked, there may be varying degrees of detail to the memory, but we've all touched on how it made us feel.
Absolutely.
That is sports. That's why it's so great.
Yep.
Because we may not remember every detail and every stat line, but we remember how it made us feel.
Amen.
That's the best.
Yep.
Jason's words are a great place to end this episode. Thanks to Jason Shepherd, Brandon Crow, Harrison Collier, and Hema Heimuli for joining me on this roundtable talking about why we love sports. Download and subscribe to Behind the Mic wherever you find podcasts, or listen to all episodes on the BYU Radio app. Behind the Mic is a production of BYU Radio.